There we go. Edited.
If they just send one little text message, that's quite enough. Is there anyone who didn't get their exam back yet? Anyone else? I've got a whole bunch here. How come I have some knowledge?
Did people take the midterm and then panic and drop it? Yeah. No, it did terrible. It's over. Yeah, I know. Anxieties. It's hell. Oh. I know. I slept 2 hours last night because of it. Well, I was doing this. Like I said, every other class for me is pretty much easy. That one I lose sleep over every week. I don't know. Political and science just don't go together in my brain. It is a science, I get it, but
Pop quiz. What governing council can be seen in the Declaration of Independence particular?
Unalienable rights versus the consent of the governed.
Okay, so here's what I have. On my CR.
That was one I got right in the first place.
Yeah.
It's okay. We don't need to put this on YouTube. Come on.
No, right. No, because the other day is the other class. The other class. Finals week is after, classes. Let's start over again. We have 3 weeks of classes, including this week, right?
Yes.
And then no more classes, and then finals week is just finals, no classes. So no, just show up for one of the 2 times for taking the exam, and that's it. Yes, and take the exam and do well. That's what I want you to do. Anyway, on my CR, I put up the study guide for the final.
All right.
I copied them because I want you guys to have a copy of it. And try to do like that. So it's front and back, one page.
I bet you anything now that people realize it's the last 3 weeks, all these video views will go way up. The last study session one had almost 100 people.
So, what was I going to say? Oh, yeah, so the final. I just for the final. And I think you guys in lab, Colette will be giving you some kind of a lab exam, but I don't know anything about what she's doing for the lab exam. That's up to her, okay? So obviously, make sure you find out what's happening. Because she's giving you a lab exam.
She said she gave us too many doubled the points on the quizzes, and there's too many. So there's extra points, and I was thinking you guys should just give them to me.
She's what?
She said there was a bunch of extra points, and I was thinking you guys should just give them to me.
Give them to you? Yeah, sure. You guys can all put it in the video. Yeah, whatever. I mean, I don't know. But but I know she's going to do something. And I know I'm in my other lab, my lab sections, I am going to give a lab exam.
Actually, I don't need them.
Colette will take care of you guys. And maybe give you some extra points with all those extra points. She gave a whole bunch of exams. Quizzes this, right? Didn't she?
Yeah.
Whatever, it worked out. It all works out in the end.
Yeah.
There was an instructor one time, not here. one of the people who used to teach told me about it was an instructor he had, and he said students were always complaining about, God, I just missed an exam, I missed an A by 3 points or something like that. So he decided to do something different in class the next year. So it was a 2-semester course, and in the first semester, he said, okay, in this semester there are going to be 5 million points. He says the first exam will be worth 1 million points. The second exam, So anyway, at the end, he had says, I missed an A by 357,000 points. So the next semester, he started the class and said, okay, this semester is going to be exactly 5 points. The first exam will be worth 1 point. Of course, he gave him like 0.837 on the exam. I missed it. I missed an A by 2/100ths of a point. So it's all relative. It doesn't really matter how many points are and how it's.
That's pretty awesome.
How they are offered, and how you did overall in the class. And I want you to do well in class. I have no desire to weed people out. I mean, I know there are a lot of instructors. When I was in college, I had a lot of them, and they thought their role was to weed people out. I don't think of that as my role. My role is to try to teach you something that I think is interesting, and I hope that you think it's interesting and get something out of it. By the way, the next semester, I am teaching physiology for some of you who are going to take physiology. As I mentioned to you before, you already know this, it is the last semester that you can take it without having had chemistry first. So consequently, there's a big rush of people to take it. So we actually opened up an extra lab section. So if you tried to sign up about a week ago, and it was already waitlisted, the 2 sections that were there are waitlisted, they've opened up a 3rd section. It's on the Monday lab, that's what it would be. And there still is, when I looked this weekend, there still was some space ahead. So, and if you're on the wait list in one of the other 2 sections and you want to make sure you're in the class, you could instead switch over to the Monday section, which is not wait listed yet, but whatever. I usually let most of the wait listed people in, so I don't mind taking extras.
Is the lab on Monday and Wednesday, or also like?
No, there's only 1 lab a week for physio, but there'll be there's one section on Monday, 1 on Wednesday, and Friday, so there's 3 lab sections to choose from. But the Wednesday, Friday lab sections are currently full, and waitlisted. But the Monday sections are full. And by the way, if you wanted to attend one of the other ones, if you just get into class like on the Monday, you say you don't want to attend the Monday, you want to attend the Wednesday, or the Friday lab. I'm not fussy about these things. I mean, these things don't matter to me. I just want you to attend the labs and learn stuff, or attend lectures and learn stuff. Not that everyone's attending lectures anymore. All you guys are the hardcore. You're here the last 3 weeks of school. This is great. So we're going to do it. I want to finish up a little from last time. I'm going to quite finish. I don't want to go into huge amounts of detail. I mentioned Hardy-Weinberg law, didn't I? I didn't mention it.
No.
I mentioned the 3 modes of natural selection, right?
Yes.
I think I did that. So I'll just real briefly from last lecture. We didn't quite finish. We'll just briefly talk about the Hardy-Weinberg law, very briefly. I'm not even going to list it. I'll just say something about it. And then we'll talk about microevolution very briefly. Macroevolution. And then I want to talk about speciation. I want to talk about a really interesting idea that's punctuated equilibrium. And then I'll say something about, we'll just talk about classification systems. That's last time. And I'm going to skip over some of that because I don't want to spend too much time on it. I do want to start on life on Earth because a lot of interesting things to talk about. So we'll talk about domains, etc. We'll talk about viruses briefly, and then we'll talk about how did life begin. We'll talk about early life. We'll talk about endosymbiosis.
Yeah, something I should have been.
Etc. We'll just do some etc. So, questions? Any questions? Does it seem warm in here? Does it seem warm to you guys? Warm in here?
Just the toilet.
Open the door wider, or maybe you should open the other door.
Yeah, but it's raining all day.
It's what? It's going to rain?
Rain all day.
It's
Is it?
Yeah.
Being sarcastic because the Weather Channel thinks they can predict the whole county.
All right, so I will say just a tiny bit about this Hardy-Weinberg law, so that if you do run across it, you at least have heard something about it. I'm not going to make a big deal about it. Hardy was a very famous mathematician, and this is early on. I don't know. This is on the 1920s or something like this. He was a very famous mathematician, high level mathematician. He went out to dinner. I think he went out to dinner with Weinberg, a friend of his, who was doing work on doing fruit fly work or something like that. And he was talking about how something about keeping track of the number of alleles of certain kinds of genes, in a population. Remember how we defined the simple definition of evolution? Change in gene frequency over time. So the question that that Weinberg was saying to him, what would be a nice way I could keep track of these alleles? And Hardy said, well, that's simple. He just gets out a napkin and he writes down what they now call the Hardy-Weinberg law. Hardy was all it is the if you took algebra, even before algebra, just the binomial expansion. You can't get too much easier than that. A plus B quantity squared. You've all seen that, and you should remember from way back when. A squared plus 2AB plus B squared, right? I mean, this is 7th grade math. And so when suddenly the geneticists were saying, hey, Hardy came up with this really great idea. Don't put my name on that. He says this is 7th grade math. They still call it the Hardy-Weinberg law. He's totally embarrassed by it because it's such a simple thing. But what it is, just let me tell you what it is. If you replace this with P and Q, because that's usually the letters they use, P and Q, P squared plus 2PQ plus Q squared. What they say, if you're looking at the frequency of alleles in a population, and you don't need to write this down. I'm never going to ask anything about the Hardy-Weinberg law on the test, okay? So I don't care if you don't even write this down. But what you're looking at is how often what is the frequency of P and Q as two different alleles in the population? And I remember when I first saw this, I mean, Hardy was a lot more sophisticated mathematically than I am, although I was a math major in college for several years. But the point is that I thought, what's the big deal about the Hardy-Weinberg law? Well, finally, it was explained to me what the big deal is. Not that this is anything exciting or complicated or revolutionary. It's totally simple. What the Hardy-Weinberg law can do for you, if you are studying allele frequency, is to see, is it changing? If it's changing, then we're saying, hey, we're seeing a change in gene frequency over time. Or if you use the Hardy-Weinberg law and say it doesn't seem to be changing, okay, we're in a period of stasis where there's no change. So that's really all it's doing. Is by looking at the frequency of alleles, you can see if that frequency is changing over time or not. That's what it really is all about. The actual law, which is stated like this,
So I was just remembering how
pretty
that
simple,
works.
pretty boring. Not much to it. So there's nothing we need to worry about. Let's talk about, just briefly, without going into a lot of detail, but macroevolution. This is development of new species. Development of new species. And here's the trick. Remember, we've said this before. Time! We're talking long periods of time. You know, it's not something that happens in a short period of time. When we're talking, you know, a large organism such as ourselves, I mean, the reproductive time for humans, we'll say, is somewhere between 25 and 33 years. That's what they usually figure. So the generation time in humans is a long period of time, quarter of a century, or maybe up to a third of a century. If you're talking about something like a bacterium, their generation time might be every half hour. You get, you know, a new bacteria growing. So that's very quick. If you're looking at insects, you know, maybe a couple of weeks. So of course, one of the things has to do with generation time, you know, and that's what. But overall, even just developing a species, we're looking at long periods of time. So we said that evolution refers to the change in gene frequency over time. If there's sufficient change in the genes in a population that make it so that two parts of the, I mean, let's say two groups of those original population don't interbreed anymore, then they can develop into what we would call new species. So most of the time, what we're talking about in terms of speciation or development of new species, usually they have to become reproductively isolated. So it's not an absolute, of course, but we're talking most of the time. Development of new species usually requires reproductive isolation. Now, how could that happen? I mean, in other words, you start off with a population which is interbreeding. You could get a group that suddenly migrated to the, you know, the other side of the mountain, and then they didn't migrate back, and so they're not interbreeding anymore. And so there could be changes slowly over time, microevolution over time, and if enough changes occurred, maybe 10,000 years, 100,000 years, and those two populations got back together, there may be sufficient change that they won't interbreed anymore. Why not? Well, I mean, it could be that one of the populations became more nocturnal and the other became more diurnal, and so their paths don't cross anymore. That could be one thing. It could be something that happened to gametes. You know, maybe the sperm can't, some changes on the sperm or changes on the egg, so they can't, you know, fertilize again. Maybe something happened to their actual, you know, reproductive apparatus, so they're not going to mate anymore. Maybe something happened to the way they attract each other, that they're no longer, one of those populations is no longer attractive in whatever way is needed to be attractive. You know, so there are all kinds of things that could happen. I mean, and you know, I'm just giving you some, throwing out ideas. Yeah.
So it's basically a sample of the gene pool becomes isolated for an extended period of time and through its own breeding and adaptation.
If there are sufficient changes,
yeah.
If there are sufficient changes, then it could be the case that if those two populations got back together, they wouldn't interbreed. Then we call them new species. And keep in mind, you know, we say new species and we say they don't interbreed, but that's somewhat relative because, you know, you can get, we talk about making a mule, you know, as the jack of the ass family, the male and the female of the mare, you know, of the horse family. But they don't ordinarily mate, but they can mate. They can have viable offspring. It's just that the offspring are sterile.
Are all mules sterile?
We do consider them, huh?
Are all
mules? You know, mules are sterile. Now you said, are all mules sterile? 99 point whatever percentage, yes. There's an occasional one that isn't, but it's very rare. It's very rare. So for practical purposes, we just say they're all sterile. You know.
I wonder if they've ever tried. I mean, that.
No,
would-
no, no. I saw a picture of one of a. It was a mule that was able to make
Other
Bible.
mules.
eggs or sperm and inseminated or was inseminated by, I think it was a horse.
Uh,
So it's like 3/4 horse, 1/4 ass, and it definitely looked like a horse, you know. But anyway, the point I'm making is that, you know, for practical purposes, we'll just say no, they're sterile. They're sterile offspring. So back to this thing about species. The species concept is not an absolute. Do keep that in mind. It's not an absolute. And so you can sometimes find species of what we call separate species that could potentially interbreed, but usually won't or aren't for various reasons. And one of those reasons might be that they're just plain isolated from each other and they're never going to get together. You know, unless a human took them and put them together. You know, say, hey, here you are, you know, Jane and Susie, or, you know, except whatever the organism is, you know. So as I said, the species concept is a little bit fuzzy, but overall it makes sense. It does make sense that different species. We'll just say it this way, make it sort of simple. Different species don't interbreed. We'll put it that way. And again, I said this is not an absolute, but for practical purposes, it is true. Was it this you guys lecture, or was it this other lecture that I told a story? It was a sad little story. I think it was this one about the little moose, the little young moose that fell in love with a cow.
No.
It was back in, I think, Vermont or Connecticut or someplace like that where they have mooses, meese, whatever you call them. Anyway, and there's this young moose. I mean, he was probably, you know, juvenile but close to full grown, and he lived nearby a little farm, and there was a cow, and he kind of fell in love with this cow, and he'd come. There was a fence between them, and he'd come over the fence, and he'd make these moose noises, which didn't mean a thing to the poor cow. She's like, who's this guy anyway? And so she just ignored him totally. She would just graze nearby, but she didn't do, you know, even pay any attention. And he was just heartbroken. It was just so sad to see. Anyway, I don't think they would have been a friend, but maybe if they got together, maybe he would have tried. I don't know. I don't think she would have let him. But anyway, so okay. One of the things for development of new species that has been very important overall is island populations. So I'm going to put this especially in island populations. And of course, we talked about this with the Galapagos Islands. And one of the things that Darwin recognized is that, you know, each of these Galapagos Islands had different species of tortoise and different species of finch and different species of various kinds of things. And it was quite obvious that they'd all originated from the same original species, you know, the same original tortoise one, the same original finch one, and all that had come over from Peru, mostly from Peru. You know, were established themselves on these separate islands, and now they're reproductively isolated because they're not going back and forth necessarily. And there's enough change over who knows how many millions of years that they did become different species, and they weren't interbreeding, I should say. Anyway, all right. Now here's the thing. In terms of tracing the history of all kinds of organisms, what has obviously become very important are fossils. Now the problem, of course, is that, you know, we'd love to have fossils of everything, but what fossilizes usually is bone, teeth, because those are really hard substances. But that doesn't mean all bones and teeth are going to fossilize, because they have to be in sort of the right circumstances. You know, if they happen to get covered up by whatever, some sediment, and then they can, you know, start changing over time and become fossilized, then they can survive. And then if we happen to find them, we can look at them and all that. But what about soft organisms, soft-bodied organisms? You know, they don't fossilize. Although we have been fortunate to find some examples. I say
Amber.
we, meaning humans, have been fortunate to find some examples. One great example, which I think I mentioned last time, was the Burgess Shale. It's up in British Columbia, but they discovered this place where what they think happened was it was in a small, I think just a little cove of the ocean or something like that. But there was probably some landslide, totally covered all these animals. And then over time, it got covered up and all that. And anyway, somehow it got discovered, and there are all kinds of impressions of invertebrates, which is great because there aren't that many good impressions of invertebrates. You know, there are others, not just the British Shale, but all kinds of unusual critters that go back to close to 600 million years ago. I mean, 500 and something million years ago, which is right around the time of the beginning of multicellular organisms. So it's pretty wild. And the people that studied this, a couple of guys, one guy from Cambridge, and some of them are so wild. One of the critters is such an unusual looking critter, he named it hallucinogenia, because it just looked like something you would picture if you were on some moon, you know. and so another one is kind of an interesting one because it has all these funny little what look like legs. I mean, except that they're these long thin things, but a whole bunch of them, and so it kind of looks like legs. And it took several years before someone said, you know, I think you're picturing it upside down. It actually should have been turned this way. So, you know, because I mean, how do you know? You're just getting the impression of these things. But the interesting thing was three-dimensional impressions, so that you can actually very incredibly carefully pull apart the rock sediment and everything, and you can get these beautiful three-dimensional impressions, which is great. Anyway, but anyway, so the point is that the fossil record, of course, is incomplete because they've only been looking for fossils for the last 100 and some odd years. They didn't know anything about them. But when they first started studying fossils, they go, whoa, look at these things. And now we have all kinds of great ways to date how old the fossil is. And anyway, so they can get pretty much an idea of when this organism existed. You know, and they've got everything from leaves to birds to, you know, whatever you name it, they have these things. Even some of the dinosaurs, of course, but some of them, you know, where you can see the impression of feathers. None of the feathers have survived, but if they have an impression of feathers, you can say, oh, that animal had feathers. And that was a big thing, a big change that happened at some point, you know. Teeth are really good because it gives you an idea of what kind of things the animal ate.
Yeah.
You know, so that's important. So anyway, all kinds of interesting things like that. But here's the funny thing. If you look at the fossil record, and you know, these things pile up on top of each other. So you in the old days, people just start digging, you know. Now they're super careful when they're doing any of their digs, as they call them. Just layer by thin little layer by thin little layer, and they collect everything in one layer and have it all properly labeled. Then they go deeper and deeper, so that they can tell, you know, which came first, you know. And anyway, if you do this, and you look at the fossil record over time, it seems like there are long periods of stasis. Stasis meaning staying the same. Stasis comes from the word meaning standing, staying. So things are staying the same. And then in what looks like a short period of time, now you have to be very careful. We're talking geology here, geological changes. So short period of time doesn't mean something like our lifetime. We're talking, you know, maybe many thousands of years, but maybe less than 100,000 or maybe something like that. But I mean, we're talking many thousands of years. So short amount of time versus a long amount of time. So starting over, so you have long periods of what appears to be stasis, and then you have a short amount of time where there's huge change. Stasis means everything staying the same, whatever the organisms are, staying the same, and then over what seems like a short amount of time, a big change, and then another kind of long period of time where it doesn't change much, and then a big change. So it kind of goes like that. People go, that's interesting. How do you explain it? Well, the best explanation is what's called punctuated equilibrium. And this is by two people, Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldridge. Gould was at, unfortunately he died just a few years ago. He was fantastic. He was at Harvard. He's written all kinds of books. He used to write an article for Natural History magazine every month. Every month it was brilliant, some new article, absolutely brilliant. He has a lot of books that are collections of those essays. Well worth looking up sometime. Wait till you've taken your final exam and get it in the summer. Read some of his books. He has one on the panda's thumb and a whole bunch of books that are really great. And he was a brilliant writer, but he was also a brilliant evolutionist. He just died about 3 or 4 years ago of cancer. It was sad because he was so good. My age, exactly my age. Anyway, Eldridge is at the Natural History Museum. Museum of Natural History. Sorry, let's put that. And the idea, what they use this, and I don't know who actually first came up with this, but they use the analogy of war. Okay, with war there are, if you're a soldier in a war, there's long periods of boredom, punctuated by brief episodes of intense terror.
Yeah.
So that's the way that's kind of the analogy they use for their the idea of the fossil record. Long periods of stasis, punctuated by short periods of time with immense change. And here's the basic idea behind punctuated equilibrium. I'm just making it very short and sweet without going into all the details. They have whole books about this, but basically the idea would be something like this. Here is some general population. We'll just say general population. And again, what we're talking about here is interbreeding. Whatever the organism is, they're freely interbreeding population. But there are some groups, we'll call them fringe groups, and I don't mean fringe in a bad way, but maybe there's some fringe group out here, and a fringe group out here, and a fringe group out here. They're somewhat isolated from the general group for whatever reason. It could be some geographical reason that they're on the other side of a mountain or something like that, or other side of a river, or whatever. But these are kind of like fringe groups. But the original same population that you can take that fringe as some slur. It's not meant to be a slur. But anyways, we'll just say these are different fringe groups, and they're somewhat semi-isolated. They were originally part of that general population. Right now, they've become isolated for whatever reason. And, because they're isolated, they may be starting to change. Now, they're not necessarily developing into a new species just yet, but they're changing, and they're reacting to, their environment. And their environment may be a little bit different from this environment because they are, maybe on the other side of a mountain or whatever it is. And so let's just say there's a bunch of change happening here over a long period of time. A million years, we'll say, okay. In the meantime, this population has changed just a little bit, not very much, whereas maybe this fringe group has changed quite a bit in certain ways. And maybe suddenly the environment changes in such a way that this fringe group is a little more able to survive in the new environment. And so suddenly, if this fringe group is a little better able to survive and it starts to come into this population, its genes and all that are going to start taking over in that population. And so there's going to be, within a relatively short amount of time, just several generations, it's going to affect the entire population. So for a long period of time, that general population, you didn't see any change in the fossil record. And then suddenly, you see a very quick change, geologically speaking. Well, of course, we don't necessarily, since finding fossils is such a chance thing anyway, if there's a large general population, you're bound to find some of these, but the fringe group, you might not find any of those in that middle period of time, because they're rare, they're not very many. But suddenly when they take over and interbreed and start passing off all their genes, then there could be a big change suddenly in that population. in the general population. Does that make some sense? And I'm not doing justice to the whole idea, but just want to give you some idea about what this punctuated equilibrium says. But it helps to explain why there is this long period of stasis punctuated by this short period of time where there's big change in the general population. Okay. What we don't see in the fossil record was the fact that this fringe group was changing during that long period of stasis, because they're not fossilizing that often. There's not that many fine fossils of them except by chance. Anyway, that's the idea. But it does make a whole lot of sense to you. Don't worry.
No, that makes sense.
It's a very important idea. But I don't want to get into super amounts of details on it. One of the things I want to do real quickly, it had to do partly with this and partly with what I have here, so I'll just do it, is classification. I want to say something about classification. And I'll take humans. Most of us in this class are humans, so
Most.
Most of us. I'm accepting myself. Anyway, but let's talk about classification, just for interest's sake, and something you should know about. The original classification started with a Swedish naturalist back, I think it was the late 1700s, maybe the early 1800s. Linné was his name, but in those days, everyone wrote, when they wrote articles, papers or something, they put it into Latin, so they gave his Latin name as Linnaeus. And he sort of started this classification system, and mainly he looked at like animals or plants and saw what they looked like, and then classified them by morphology. Now they're much more scientific the way they classify things, but nonetheless we more or less follow his classification scheme. And what they do, what something is new now, with maybe the last 15 years, we now start with what they call the domains. And they didn't used to do this, say 15 years ago they didn't start with the domain as the biggest category. Now what's the basic unit of all life?
Water.
Tiny thing. No. I mean the little.
Oh, carbon.
Bacteria.
Cell. Well, I went to cell. I went to cell. Period. Is that what you said?
Bacteria.
Oh, bacteria. Well, they rule. The bacteria rule. And okay, but the cell is the basic unit of all life. In the old days, we just said, okay, all organisms are made of cells. That's fine. They are. But now they say, there are three basic types of cells and they're basing the cells on things like the ribosomal RNA, they're basing it on cell membrane, all these kinds of things. So they actually now have three domains. And one domain, whatever, let's do three domains. So they take bacteria, the archaea if you like, the eukaryotic cells. Eukarya, we'll say it like that. But both the bacteria and the archaea are prokaryotic cells. And we used to just say, we just called them all some kind of bacteria, the archaea and the archaea. We just included them all in one category as prokaryotic cells. I really don't see that it's necessary to do this, but we do it now, so I'll do it too. It's fine. The weird thing is that if you look at the archaea, there's some strange little critters in there. A lot of them are what we now call the extremophiles. Phile part means love, but they love the extreme environments. So, for example, there are these they're all one-cell little prokaryotic cell types, but there's some that love to live in high temperatures, very high temperatures, like in
Volcanic vents.
Say it again.
Volcanic vents in the ocean.
Were you thinking the ones in the ocean?
Yeah.
The vents in the ocean, or the ones that live in the hot springs, or whatever. Some live in high salt, some live in high acid content, some live in and they think that some of these cells are the offspring of the relatives, eventual relatives of some of the earliest forms of life on Earth. Which, hard to know, but there are certain differences there's a lot of similarities between these guys, Archaea and Archaea, because they are prokaryotic and they are single-celled. But there's certain big differences, and some of the differences have to do with their ribosomes and the ribosomal RNA that makes it up. And the ribosomal RNA that makes up Archaea is more similar to the ribosomal RNA that makes up
Eukarya.
eukaryotic cells than it is bacteria. So now once they did all that work, they decided, let's just put that in a separate domain. Okay, so that's what those domains are. Let's not worry about all the other, I'm not going to go into all, because I will talk about some of this in the future. I just want to show you what we use. I'll take humans. Let's take humans. So we're obviously in the kingdom of the eukarya, or eukaryota. I guess they put eukaryota. Let's do it this way. I think this is the way they usually do it. I should do it that way. But you'll see it, eukarya. Okay, so that would be the domain. We're in the kingdom Animalia. Okay, and then the phylum Chordata. By the way, I'm not having you memorize all this whole classification. Don't worry.
The animal kingdom and.
So the animal kingdom, as opposed to the plant kingdom, as opposed to the protozoa, and all that. But anyway, okay. But let me just do this and leave a little bit of space in between these, and I'll show you why. Class, where the class is where you have the birds and the reptiles and the mammals and all that. So we're under Mammalia. And then our order, primates. And then in the family, there are the Hominidae. Now, I want you to leave some space because I'm going to show you some subphyla and things like that just for interest. As I said, I don't want you to memorize this. Then the genus is Homo
Sapien.
And the species is Sapiens. What? Okay, so write that for a second. But as I said, I'm going to put a couple things in between in just a second. But before we do that, let's just mention that when they, talk about an organism, they usually will just list as genus and species. And the way, just so you know this, it's nothing I'm going to test you on, but just so you know when you do a genus species, you're supposed to put the genus with a capital letter and the species with a small letter. And it's supposed to be italicized. So if you have your computer, you can change it to italics. But if you are just writing it out, you're supposed to underline it. But so the genus, and again, this is just the proper way of doing it. The genus is capitalized, the species is small letter. Okay? And so Homo sapiens, or sometimes they would just put, for a lot of times, let's put whatever the genus is and put the first letter with the period after H period sapiens or something like that. But Homo sapiens, and actually with humans, this is something that's somewhat questionable. Homo means man, okay? Sapiens means wise. So there's some doubt if that's a very accurate description, right? Wise man. And actually, there's several subspecies because technically they call us, modern humans, Homo sapiens sapiens. So we'd be Homo sapiens sapiens, as opposed to Homo sapiens neanderthalensis. We'll talk about these guys in the future. Because we probably could have been and probably were interbreeding, so probably the same species. So these are just like sapiens, it's supposed to be P here, sorry. So that means wise man, which is even more ridiculous as far as I'm concerned. No, anyway, whatever. That's the name. The reason I was hesitating a little bit, not hesitating, but I said leave some space, is the phylum is Chordata, and it refers to what's called a notochord. And there's one animal that is represented in one of these subphyla that has a notochord but doesn't have a vertebral column. The rest of most all the rest of these organisms in that same phylum are in the subphylum vertebrata.
What is the phylum?
It's just a group, a large group. I mean, it's. Let me write this down, and then
Right.
if you want me to give you a definition, I'm not sure I can. Okay.
No, it's okay. I was just, if you don't know, I'll look it up.
Well, what I mean is, they'll take all the animals, and they say, okay, what kinds of next big category can we put them in? Okay, so all the animals that have a
Vertebrae.
vertebral column. Actually, as I said, it's a subphylum in this case, just because technically it's a notochord, which we don't need to worry about for us. But anyway, but what about all the ones that are, so then everything else doesn't have a vertebral column. Okay, okay, so then we're going to say, well, some of them are roundworms, some of them are flying insects, some are, so they'll put all these things into separate categories. Generally speaking, what this classification system does is show you relationships, and usually evolutionary relationships. So in other words, we're mammals, so we're much more closely related to other mammals than we are to birds, because birds would be in a separate class. They'd be in a separate class called aves, and we're, but birds and mammals and reptiles and all that, they're more closely related than any of us is to an insect or a roundworm or a sea urchin, or you know what I'm saying. But those are all animals, but they're in a different big grouping, which we call a phylum. Then the next grouping down is called a class. So that's just how you do it. So with class, we have mammals and the reptiles and birds and fishes and all that. And then primates, but there are a lot of different primates, everything from lemurs to, and actually, if you saw Madagascar, you know about lemurs, and all those other funny little critters in there. And those are all real, by the way. The people who made that movie made sure that they did a good job on all their different animals. Those are all real animals in Madagascar and other places. But if you've seen lemurs, they have some similarities to monkeys and to humans, but they're not, they're more similar to monkeys and everything than they would be to some other kind of mammal, or like a dog or a cat or something like that, because dogs and cats and whales and all those are mammals. But primates, where we have things like the opposable thumb and whatever else, forward-looking eyes and some other things like that. Then there's the family Hominidae, and then as I say, the genus and species. But there are other things I didn't put in here, but there's some subcategories, like mammals. What is it that makes a mammal? What is the absolute thing that makes a mammal?
Mother's milk.
Mother's milk, mammary glands, and that's where mammalian comes from. Hair is the number 2. Most mammals have hair. I think there are a few don't. But almost all mammals have hair, but they all have mammary glands. With the textbook we used last year. Well, and then but the other thing you think about is live birth. But there are 2 mammals that don't have live birth. They lay eggs. What are they?
Platypus.
Platypus and the echidna, the duck-billed platypus, so-called duck-billed platypus, and the echidna. They lay eggs, but when the little egg hatches into a little baby like platypus, it nurses. Now the book last semester said they don't have nipples and they don't latch on. No, that's not true. They do. But that used to be they used to think that the milk just oozed from the mammary glands and the little baby would lap it up off it. No. The little baby platypus latches onto the mammary glands and nurses just like any other mammal. So, but they are egg laying, and then there are other big grouping of mammals is pouched mammals, kangaroos and all that, and then of course the placental mammals like humans and dogs and cats and whales and all those that have a placenta. So with respect to the mammals, there'd be 3. There are 3 separate subclasses, depending on whether you're egg laying or a pouch mammal or a placental mammal. Anyway, and then we're of course in the placentals, and then in the placental mammals you have all things from carnivores to herbivores, and with the herbivores you have the even-toed animals and the odd-toed animals. And, for Perissodactyls and Artiodactyls are all the, there's all these fancy terms for them, and various other kinds of mammals. And then, but then we're a primate in the family Hominidae and then Homo sapiens. So anyway, so that's the classification. So let's actually get to what is the official topic. Official topic for today, which is life on Earth. So let's talk about that. But before I talk about living things, that the three domains that we talk about, there's one organism that I will say more about in the future that isn't represented in the classification system of living things, life on Earth. Because what's the basic unit of life?
The cell.
The cell. And so these little critters are not nice because we only know about them because they cause disease, but they're not made of cells. What are we talking about?
Viruses.
Viruses. So we'll say more about viruses in the future, but viruses they're biological entities. They just aren't made of cells. I'll just give you a real quick thing, and then I won't say any more about it because I could go on and on. They're one of my favorite topics actually, but they don't have a chance to teach micro anymore, so I can't talk about them as much. Viruses, they're called obligate, intracellular parasites. Obligate means they have to do whatever we're talking about. Intra, now look at this word intra. This word means within. Because you also see the word inter, I-N-T-E-R. That means surrounding. But intra means within. So what does it mean? They have to be within a cell. So they're obligate, they have to be within a cell in order to do whatever they're going to do. And what they're going to do is nice because they're a parasite. So they're going to take, so they don't give anything in return. And what they do, viruses are just made of nucleic acid surrounded by a protein coat. I'll just stop it. I don't want to keep going because I can keep going.
And this is all stuff covered
so
in
nucleic
microbes.
acid, you know about that. That's something biological. Isn't it protein? You know about that. But that's not a cell. It's not a cell. There's no cell membrane. All cells have a cell membrane. This is not. I didn't say anything about a cell membrane. They don't have one. And a virus is totally inert, sitting around on its own. But if it gets inside the right cell, and by the way, it has to be the right cell, not just any old cell. If it gets inside the proper cell, it turns that cell into a virus factory. And so the cell does all the work. The virus doesn't do any work at all. It just provides information in the form of nucleic acid. And that information then is used by the cell. Not that the cell wants to do it, it just doesn't have any choice. And the cell starts churning out new viruses. And much of the time the cell dies in the process, but it's given off, maybe one little virus gets in there, and maybe it'll cause 50,000 new viruses to be made, and the cell dies and releases all these new viruses, and they go looking for more cells to infect. So it's pretty nasty, pretty mean. So they're weird. They're weird little critters, and they don't fit into our normal classification scheme because they're not cellular. They're biological entities because they're made of all these biological molecules, but they're not cellular. So since we define life as based on cells, we can't classify it. And then you can say, well, are viruses alive or dead?
We don't.
To be honest, it'd be however you want to define living or not living. And if you define living as being made of a cell and metabolizing all that, you'd say, well, then they're not living. If you define living as having some kind of information in the form of nucleic acid to somehow arrange for your own replication, even if you don't do it yourself, you're having someone else do it, well, then you could say, okay, it could fit into the category. So it's a matter of definition. That's kind of weird. And, you go way back to that first lecture we had, which was eons ago, I think it was, wasn't it? Several geological epochs ago when we had our first lecture. And I gave you all these various characteristics of life. And
Very
viruses
ordered.
don't fit most of those characteristics. But if you wanted to make a definition of life that would include those, that would be fine. There's nothing that says they're not, living. It's just a matter of definition. How old are they? That's an excellent question which we can't answer. And here's the other thing. Viruses usually are very specific as far as what cell they attack. It all has to do with what in physio, you guys who take my physio class, I'm going to call the R word, receptors. You've got to have the right receptor to get into your cell, whatever cell it is. Most viruses are highly specific with respect to what cell they attack. Some viruses are a little more promiscuous. Rabies is one that seems to be able to attack maybe any warm-blooded animal, maybe other animals too, for all I know. But most viruses are very specific. And the other thing I was going to say, which kind of goes along with your question, is that every organism that they've checked, and they haven't checked most of them, but every one they've checked, they found some virus or more than one virus that will attack it. So viruses are just out there. They're as one would say, ubiquitous. They're all over the place. But the early ones that they studied were bacterial viruses because bacteria are easy to grow. And, they couldn't see a bacterial virus until they had the electron microscope, and now they know what they look like. But they found them in all kinds of plants and insects. They've studied a lot of insect viruses, etc. But I don't want to get into all these details. Yeah.
Just a question.
Yeah.
Do you probably know off the top of your head how long the average virus survives on its own?
That's a good question, and depending on the virus. And one thing I didn't say to you is that some viruses, if the virus just has this, they're said to be, oh my gosh, I'm going to say it out loud, naked. Oh my God, they are. But if some of them are surrounded by what seems like a membrane, sort of a membranous coat, then they're said to be envelope. The envelope ones tend not to survive that well outside of, for very long outside of cells. And the naked ones probably survive a lot longer. But longer, I don't know.
But
Maybe months, maybe years, maybe, who knows.
By survive, you mean when
being able to infect a cell.
Okay.
See,
But
that
there's a
can-
time limit on that. So they can be
Depends.
destroyed if not necessarily killed.
Oh, not every cell that is invaded by a virus is killed. No, it is true.
No, I mean the virus itself can be destroyed if it's not alive.
Some of them will, some of the ones, like the ones with that membrane around them, detergents could kind of mess up the membrane a bit. For example, they wouldn't survive. But some others could last in water for who knows how long. Polio, for example, probably could last for months, maybe, who knows? I don't know.
Thank you,
It's a
John
good question.
Salt.
I don't
But
think anyone
yeah.
knows. Yeah.
Oh
Oh God, you want to get into that?
Well, I just don't understand how someone would be killed,
Again, when you say live virus, what you're talking about is a virus that can actually set up an infection,
Right.
as opposed to a killed virus. But when they gave like with polio, we'll take polio as an example. That was a huge, scary disease. When I was growing up, every summer you panic because somebody in your neighborhood or you know somebody who got polio, and it could paralyze people, and people would live for 40, 50 years paralyzed from the neck down. I had a cousin who got paralyzed. She actually came out of it, so she wasn't paralyzed for life, but other people were. Other people died, so I mean it was serious. I remember it was in 9th grade when I got the first polio shot, and I go, oh God, I don't have to worry about polio anymore. I mean, it was a big deal. But anyway, the point was that there were two different things. Salk did the killed virus. So they actually took the virus, killed it, then injected it into people. Now they had to grow the virus. They're growing it in like monkey kidney cells and stuff like that because they have to grow it in something that will grow in primates, and then they clean it up, purify it and all that, but they kill it and then give it to you. So if you got it, you wouldn't get the disease, but your immune system would go, oh, there's some foreign material there. Let's start a reaction to it. The live virus, they didn't give it straight because then you would have gotten polio, but they would incapacitate it, if you want to call it that, inactivate it. It was inactivated. They did something to inactivate it, but it would go through the motions of a normal infection, but you didn't get sick. And again, your immune system is more.
Will create antibodies to fight
The
it.
problem with the live virus is occasionally,
Get
every so
infected.
often, they would revert back to being active instead of inactivated. And so the Sabin kind was the inactivated live virus. That was when they put on a sugar cube or drop on the little baby's tongue. But it came out in the diapers, and you had to be careful when you're handling diapers. But now they've kind of switched back. They were going just to that. Now they're doing some of the Sabin again. But anyway, I don't want to get into all that. It's all interesting stuff, and I can tell you tons about it. But I really think that's so fascinating. I want to go on. Yes, yes.
Well, I just heard that polio is coming back because
They're worried.
people are getting vaccinated.
They're worried about polio right now because it apparently is. People are afraid of vaccines, and that's one of the greatest public health advances ever. That and antibiotics, and it's just a shame that people are afraid of vaccines because, good God, it is saving so many lives.
Irrational fear.
But there's a bunch of fear going on about vaccines, but boy, as soon as near polio, you don't want anyone getting polio. And anyway, let's not get into this now because it's a great topic, and I'm not trying to knock it as a topic. But let's just talk. I want to talk about life. Life. Let's. How old's the universe?
13.8 billion years, approximately. We can't see past that wall.
I had mine as 13.7, 13.8 billion years old. Okay, that's billion years.
Yes.
Long time ago. It started right before my time. Earth. How about Earth?
About 3.5 to 4
Well, a little more
billion.
than that. I
4
have
billion?
about 4.6, and you can you see things that vary on
Yeah, it just changed.
billion years old, but somewhere around 4.5 billion years, say roughly. So it started quite a bit after the universe. Now, what we're talking about is that Big Bang. You've all heard about the Big Bang, but anyway, so all sorts of star stuff is out there floating around, expanding, moving, and some of it starts to coalesce because of gravity, and eventually you form various stars, and in some cases, in many cases, as it turns out, some planetary systems formed around the stars. And so the Earth is about 4.6 billion years old, roughly. Now, here's the thing. In the last 20 years, and especially the last 10 years, they've really been looking for planets. First of all, they hypothesize that there are trillions of planets out there, but trying to prove that there are. They know they're stars, you can see them, but you can't see planets directly, right? They don't make any light. But they sent this Kepler spaceship up there, and it found all kinds of planetary systems. What they're looking for is what they call the Goldilocks planets.
Just right.
Just right for life. It's not too hot, not too cold. They've got and if you think about it, we're in a unique place in the universe here. I don't mean it's the only place on Earth. That's what I mean. Only place in the universe, but unique does mean one. But it's an unusual place because our temperature. If you're too close to a sun, the temperature is way too hot. If you're too far away from a star, I should say, the temperature is way too cold. We're in that temperature where water is liquid. That's not common in the universe.
It's mostly ice, yeah.
But in the what did I just say? Goldilocks planets. In the Goldilocks planets, the conditions are just right. You could have liquid water. And presumably the other conditions that would allow life. We know that life occurred once because we're here. We, meaning biologists, certainly think that there are probably millions of planets in the universe that have life. Can we prove it? It's going to be tough. and the answer is no, we can't. We can only hypothesize, and we can only look for planets close to us, meaning within several light years away, and see the conditions. But keep in mind, we're in one galaxy. It's not even a huge galaxy. It's a medium-sized galaxy, or a pretty big galaxy, Milky Way. We're just one star, our star system, out of 100 billion, roughly, stars. And they figure there are about 100 billion galaxies,
yeah.
and each galaxy has about 100 billion stars. So think about how many stars there are in this universe.
Law of averages say.
It's huge,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
And so that's why they think that there are probably, billions of stars. And if there, I mean, planetary systems. And if there are billions of planetary systems, there must be hundreds of thousands of them that have the Goldilocks conditions. And of those ones with the Goldilocks conditions, some of them, other than just us, probably formed life. Did life form the same way it formed here? Who knows? We have no way of knowing. We haven't come across any of them. If you believe in flying saucers and aliens, that's fine.
No.
I think there are some that never mind. Yeah. Question, I saw a hand up. No?
Oh,
Yeah.
Well, I was just, you pretty much answered.
Okay. But but life did form. So let's say life started. The best estimates at the moment, anyway, is that life started about 3.8 billion. We'll say started about 3.8. Now, what we usually go is billion years ago. That's BYA for billion years ago. MYA would be million years ago. Which is kind of amazing if you think about it, because it was roughly a billion years after Earth formed, some living things formed. And by life, we mean some kind of self-replicating organism. Membranous thing, self-replicating, and all that. Now, for the next, we'll say for the next 3.2 billion years, the life forms were all single-celled organisms. So BY for billion years. For the next 3.2 billion years, life was single-celled organisms. Mainly like what we used to call bacteria or the archaea. Single-celled organisms. And something happened about 600 billion years ago that allowed multicellular organisms to begin. So we're talking about, that's about 0.6 billion years. So about 6 billion years, 0.6 billion years, 6.6 billion years.
600 million years.
Which is 600 million. 600 million. Okay.
Multiple cellular.
Years ago, multicellular forms started.
But life is it's suggestive to say that it's just a reaction of several elements in the right conditions in a localized area, right?
And it took a long time, right?
Yeah, but that's all it is.
That's
Atoms.
the hard part.
Atoms.
Long time period.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's 0.6 billion, 0.6 billion years, which is
Would be
600
Million. Yeah.
years ago. Okay. Not put 600 million here. Just write out 600 million. Again, that quantity of time is so beyond our imagination. I mean, we can write it and talk about it, but it's pretty hard to understand.
Mm. But
what's one of the things that seems to have happened? And it's that endosymbiotic theory. Do I have it listed up here? Yeah. Endosymbiosis. So early life was probably fermentative. Early life probably was mainly fermentative. They would just ferment whatever. And what did those organisms do? Some of them ate just some of the junk that was in the primordial soup. Would you love primordial soup? Would you like to have for dinner?
Sure.
The primordial ooze. Some people refer to it as a primordial ooze. But then a few then photosynthesis started. How? I can't tell you.
Was it really there were autotrophs before there was photosynthesis? Producers?
Yeah, but there was probably a lot of available nutrients in the sea.
Okay.
You say because most of the stuff could happen in the oceans or whatever. But somehow photosynthesis began, not necessarily the kind that gave off oxygen, but I'll say then something like the blue-greens, we'll say the blue-greens, gave off we'll just say gave off oxygen. So now suddenly you had oxygen in the environment, because until we had photosynthesis with giving off oxygen, there wasn't any oxygen, presumably. It would have all been used up in some way. And then some aerobic organisms began, aerobic bacteria.
Using oxygen.
Developed. Of course, it wouldn't help to be aerobic if there's no oxygen, but if there's oxygen and you somehow got some mutations that allowed you to use them, hey, you're going to get a lot more energy out of that, right? Mm-hmm. And then what happened? We had this endosymbiosis.
A change.
And we're talking, I have figures that you can give as approximations, but I don't know if I even want to put those down. But what they think happened was this so-called endosymbiosis. And what happened there is some early fermentative organism that did glycolysis, for example, engulfed some aerobic bacterium, and it developed into a mitochondrion. One of those enveloped one of those blue-greens and was able to photosynthesize, and that guy became those little things it ate, except it didn't eat them, it stayed there, it became the chloroplast. And engulf, we'll say, aerobic bacterium became, instead of being eaten and being destroyed, they formed this nice relationship, became mitochondria. Now we're not talking a short period of time here, but
so they all began to work together in the same cell, which is exactly what this word means.
Became chloroplast. And it was these kinds of things that then allowed all these multicellular organisms to begin. So, what I wanted to say just a little bit about, very briefly, were some experiments that were done. I don't want to do it now, I'm kind of running out of time, but maybe briefly I want to talk about some experiments. Because, starting in the 1950s, I mean, people before that thought about it, but starting in the 1950s, some people said, maybe we could try to simulate the early conditions of the Earth,
right,
and see what might happen.
Right.
And I wanted to tell you about some of the experiments that have been done. And then keep in mind, we're never going to be able to create life, because how long does it take to
I was going to say, we don't have time.
Years.
Like, what's the point?
But what we can show is the kinds of conditions that occurred and how some biological molecules might have been produced that would then allow this primordial soup, I just love that term, but allow an accumulation of all kinds of things in this primordial soup. Amino acids and nucleotides and all these other things that then could maybe by accident get together and form stuff. Well, anyway, I'll give you some of the experiments that have been done just to show you how these things, all it does is show plausibility. It doesn't show you, we can't say how it happened. We can only talk about experiments that show that it was plausible that it happened. Weird. By the way, some people still think that life was seeded on this planet by some other, maybe meteors. I still think it formed here to begin with, but I can't.
It had to start somewhere, so whether or not it was altered by other planets is different.
All right, so let's stop at this point and we'll continue on with life. Well, we'll talk about some human.
That's an attempt to put off the uncaused cause.
Is the projector still malfunctioning here?